Virus transmission in hotels on either parts of the country, it's happening a lot. What more do we need to do to bolster hotel quarantine?
Well, Danica, I think we're potentially sitting on a powder keg here. And as we've talked about before, city hotels are not designed as quarantine facilities for a number of reasons. And principally, what we know now about COVID is that airborne transmission is the principal mode of transmission. And these hotels just don't have the adequate airflow filtration to stop people being cross-infected, as we've seen, as you say, on both sides of the country.
Does it now pour cold water on the idea floated by Scott Morrison of home quarantine?
Look, I think it does at the moment. We're in a really difficult situation because we've got this massive problem in India. We've got 300,000 cases a day in India. And remember, that's the ones that are proven on testing. So that's probably half, if not a quarter of them. So India, I really agree with our Premier on this one, that I think repatriation flights from India need to be paused at the moment with the number of cases they're seeing and with all the variants. And I think it really puts the prospect of home quarantine on the back burner as well. What we must be looking at is dedicated quarantine facilities. We only have one in Australia at the moment, which is Howard Springs in the Northern Territory. That's now got 20 plus active cases there. We've got the potential merging of domestic and international quarantine there as well, and the AUSMAT team may be moving away, so that might downgrade Howard Springs' ability a little bit. So I think at this stage we've really got to look at reformatting the whole quarantine process.
Let's talk about India now. The West Australian Premier Mark McGowan says that Australia should look at pausing flights from India. Do you think the time has come?
I think the time has come at the moment with the Indian situation out of control, with, as we say, 300,000 plus cases a day, with the hospitals completely overwhelmed with all these new variants, with increased infectiousness. I'm sorry, but I just think, and I know it sounds like the non-humanitarian thing to do, but at this stage, I think it's unsafe to be bringing people from India back into Australia. And a lot of these people, as we know, they're supposed to be tested before flights, but sometimes these tests are not legitimate. And we worry about people getting on board the flight that are already infected and then obviously coming into hotels and passing it to workers and to other quarantine guests. So at the moment, I think the Indian situation is way too out of control for us to be accepting people back into Australia. And it may be only for another few weeks, but I think it's time to pause it.
You mentioned Howard Springs, and it's now dealing with its highest number of cases since it began handling the repatriation flights. Was this inevitable, given it is our only en masse facility in the country?
Absolutely inevitable. And, the federal government are totally to blame here. You can't blame the states. We really have needed, for months now, dedicated quarantine facilities. We had the Wagner brothers wanting to build a facility at Wellcamp outside Toowoomba with an international grade airport there. And that's just been, and the Queensland government supporting that. And that's just been pushed by Scott Morrison onto the back burner, hoping that they'll find an easier solution. And it's really been the federal government and the New South Wales government that have been the major impediment here in developing proper quarantine facilities, and I just don't know why. But we're going to get our fingers burnt, and inevitably, if we don't do something, we're going to have another outbreak, whether people are vaccinated or not. It will be difficult to control, and we don't want that to happen.
Just finally, I want to ask you about the vaccine rollout. How do you think we can restore confidence in the vaccine itself? Today, the New South Wales government has announced that there's been a 70 to 80% increase in no-shows and appointment cancellations at GPs since the AstraZeneca advice came out. How do we restore confidence in the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is a tragedy. This is a tragedy that this has been allowed to happen, and some of my colleagues have been totally guilty in this, and some of my AMA colleagues have been totally guilty in this as well. We've lost perspective on the risks, and the risk of blood clotting with AstraZeneca, again, as we've discussed before, is about 3 to 4 per million. As we recognise and contest for this, then the mortality will go right down. And I've calculated the risk of dying from blood clots now with AstraZeneca is about 1 in 5 million, as against the risk if you're elderly of dying of COVID of about 1 in 100. So I don't know how we restore confidence other than trying to get people to really accept these figures. I'm very happy. I've had AstraZeneca. I'm very happy for my family to have that as well. We really need this to be our workhorse vaccine. We're not going to get big doses of Pfizer until the last quarter of the year. We're not going to be able to manufacture it locally for probably 10 to 12 months. So we must move with AstraZeneca, accept that the risk is very, very slight, but we do have tests for it that are reliable, and people should go ahead and get it done, particularly the over 50s and anyone at risk.
Dr. Clay Golledge, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Danica.